The clave rhythmic pattern is used as a tool for temporal organization in Afro-Cuban music, such as abakúa, rumba, conga de comparsa, son montuno, mambo, salsa, Latin jazz, songo and timba. The five-stroke clave pattern represents the structural core of many Afro-Cuban rhythms. The clave pattern originated in sub-Saharan African music traditions, where it serves essentially the same function as it does in Cuba. In ethnomusicology, clave is also known as a key pattern, guide pattern, phrasing referent, timeline, or asymmetrical timeline. The clave pattern is also found in the African diaspora musics of Haitian vodou drumming, Afro-Brazilian music and Afro-Uruguayan music. The clave pattern is used in North American popular music as a rhythmic motif or ostinato, or simply a form of rhythmic decoration. Etymology, Anglicized pronunciation, clave. Clave is a Spanish word meaning code, key, as in key to a mystery or puzzle, or keystone, the wedge-shaped stone in the center of an arch that ties the other stones together. Clave is also the name of the patterns played on claves. Two hardwood sticks used in Afro-Cuban music ensembles a euro p plus or minus a loza. The key to Afro-Cuban rhythm. Just as a keystone holds an arch in place, the clave pattern holds the rhythm together in Afro-Cuban music. The two main clave patterns used in Afro-Cuban music are known in North America as son clave and the rumba clave. Both are used as bell patterns across much of Africa. Son and rumba clave can be played in either a triple pulse or duple pulse structure. The contemporary Cuban practice is to write the duple pulse clave in a single measure of 4/4. It is also written in a single measure in ethnomusicological writings about African music. Although they subdivide the beats differently, the 12/8 and 4/4 versions of each clave share the same pulse names. The correlation between the triple pulse and duple pulse forms of clave, as well as other patterns, is an important dynamic of sub-Saharan-based rhythm. Every triple pulse pattern has its duple pulse correlative. Son clave has strokes on 1, 1, 2 and 3 and 4. 4/4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a, x. 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 XX. 12/8. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a, XXX. XX. Rumba clave has strokes on 1, 1, 2, 3 and 4. 4/4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a, x. 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 XX. 12/8. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and a, XX. XXX. Both clave patterns are used in rumba. What we now call son clave used to be the key pattern played in Havana-style yamba and gaguanca cubed. Some Havana-based rumba groups still use son clave for yamba. The musical genre known as son probably adopted the clave pattern from rumba when it migrated from eastern Cuba to Havana at the beginning of the 20th century. During the 19th century, African music and European music sensibilities were blended together in original Cuban hybrids. Cuban popular music became the conduit through which sub-Saharan rhythmic elements were first codified within the context of European music theory. The first written music rhythmically based on clave was the Cuban danza cubden, which premiered in 1879. The contemporary concept of clave with its accompanying terminology reached its full development in Cuban popular music during the 1940s. Its application has since spread to folkloric music as well. In a sense, the Cubans standardized their myriad rhythms, both folkloric and popular, by relating nearly all of them to the clave pattern. The veiled code of African rhythm was brought to light due to Clave Euro unregistered trademark's omnipresence. Consequently, the term clave has come to mean both the five-stroke pattern and the total matrix it exemplifies. In other words, the rhythmic matrix is the clave matrix. Clave is the key that unlocks the enigma. It decodes the rhythmic puzzle. Euro unregistered trademark commonly understood that the actual clave pattern does not need to be played in order for the music to be in Clave Euro P plus or minus a loza. One of the most difficult applications of the clave is in the realm of composition and arrangement of Cuban and Cuban-based dance music. Regardless of the instrumentation, the music for all of the instruments of the ensemble must be written with a very keen and conscious rhythmic relationship to the clave. Any Euro breaks a Euro unregistered trademark and or a Euro stops a Euro unregistered trademark in the arrangements must also be a Euro in clave a Euro unregistered trademark. If these procedures are not properly taken into consideration, then the music is out of clave which, if not done intentionally, is considered an error. When the rhythm and music are a Euro in clave, a Euro unregistered trademark, a great natural a Euro swing a Euro unregistered trademark is produced, regardless of the tempo. All musicians who write and or interpret Cuban-based music must be a Euro clave conscious, a Euro unregistered trademark, not just the percussionists a Euro Santos. Clave theory. There are three main branches of what could be called clave theory. Cuban popular music, first is the set of concepts and related terminology, which were created and developed in Cuban popular music from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. In popular Cuban music, Emilio Granet defines in general terms, how the duple pulse clave pattern guides all members of the music ensemble. An important Cuban contribution to this branch of music theory is the concept of the clave as a musical period, which has two rhythmically opposing halves. The first half is antecedent and moving, and the second half is consequent and grounded. Ethnomusicological studies of African rhythm. The second branch comes from the ethnomusicological studies of sub-Saharan African rhythm. In 1959, Arthur Morris Jones published his landmark work Studies in African Music, in which he identified the triple pulse clave as the guide pattern for many musics from ethnic groups across Africa. An important contribution of ethnomusicology to clave theory is the understanding that the clave matrix is generated by cross-rhythm. The 3-2/2-3 clave concept and terminology, the third branch comes from the United States. Ironically, there are more books published about Afro-Cuban rhythms in the U.S. than in Cuba itself. An important North American contribution to clave theory is the worldwide propagation of the 3-2/2-3 concept and terminology, which arose from the fusion of Cuban rhythms with jazz in New York City. Only in the last couple of decades have the three branches of clave theory begun to reconcile their shared and conflicting concepts. Thanks to the popularity of Cuban-based music and the vast amount of educational material available on the subject, many musicians today have a basic understanding of clave. Contemporary books that deal with clave share a certain fundamental understanding on what clave means. Chris Wasburn considers the term to refer to the rules that govern the rhythms played with the claves. Bertram Lehman regards the clave as a concept with wide-ranging theoretical syntactic implications for African music in general, and for David P. ±Aloza, the clave matrix is a comprehensive system for organizing music a Euro 2 Saint. Mathematical analysis. In addition to these three branches of theory, clave has in recent years been thoroughly analyzed mathematically. The structure of clave can be understood in terms of cross-rhythmic ratios, above all, 3:2. Godfred Toussaint, a research professor of computer science, has published a book and several papers on the mathematical analysis of clave and related African bell patterns. Toussaint uses geometry and the Euclidean algorithm as a means of exploring the significance of clave. Types. Sun clave. The most common clave pattern used in Cuban popular music is called the sun clave, named after the Cuban musical genre of the same name. Clave is the basic period, composed of two rhythmically opposed cells, one antecedent and the other consequent. Clave was initially written in two measures of 2/4-inch Cuban music. When written this way, each cell or clave half is represented within a single measure. 3 sides/2 side. The antecedent half has 3 strokes and is called the 3 side of clave. The consequent half of clave has 2 strokes and is called the 2 side. Going only slightly into the rhythmic structure of our music, we find that all its melodic design is constructed on a rhythmic pattern of 2 measures, as though both were only one. The first is antecedent, strong, and the second is consequent, Granet. With clave, The two measures are not at odds, but rather, they are balanced opposites like positive and negative, expansive and contractive, or the poles of a magnet. As the pattern is repeated, an alternation from one polarity to the other takes place, creating pulse and rhythmic drive. Were the pattern to be suddenly reversed, the rhythm would be destroyed, as in a reversing of one magnet within a series. The patterns are held in place according to both the internal relationships between the drums and their relationship with clave. Should the drums fall out of clave, the internal momentum of the rhythm will be dissipated and perhaps even broken. Amira and Cornelius. Tresillo. In Cuban popular music, the first three strokes of son clave are also known collectively as tresillo, a Spanish word meaning triplet, that is, three equal beats in the same time as two main beats. However, in the vernacular of Cuban popular music, the term refers to the figure shown here. Rumba clave. The other main clave pattern is the rumba clave. Rumba clave is the key pattern used in Cuban rumba. Use of the triple pulse form of rumba clave in Cuba can be traced back to the iron bell part in abakúa music. The form of rumba known as Colombia is culturally and musically connected with abakúa, which is an Afro-Cuban cabildo that descends from the Calabari of Cameroon. Colombia also uses this pattern. Sometimes 12/8 rumba clave is clapped in the accompaniment of Cuban bata drums. The 4/4 form of rumba clave is used in yamba, Afro-Cuban and popular music. There is some debate as to how the 4/4 rumba clave should be notated for Afro-Cuban and yamba. In actual practice, the third stroke on the 3 side and the first stroke on the 2 side often fall in rhythmic positions that do not fit neatly into music notation. Triple pulse strokes can be substituted for duple pulse strokes. Also, the clave strokes are sometimes displaced in such a way that they don't fall within either a triple pulse or duple pulse grid. Therefore, many variations are possible. The first regular use of rumba clave in Cuban popular music began with the Mozambique, created by Pello el African in the early 1960s. When used in popular music, rumba clave can be perceived in either a 3-2 or 2-3 sequence. Standard bell pattern. The 7-stroke standard bell pattern contains the strokes of both clave patterns. Some North American musicians call this pattern clave. Other North American musicians refer to the triple pulse form as the 6/8 bell because they write the pattern in 2 measures of 6/8. Like clave, the standard pattern is expressed in both triple and duple pulse. The standard pattern has strokes on 1, 1A, 2 and 2A, 3 and 4, 4A. 12/8. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a XXXXXXX. 4/4. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a X. X. XX. XX. X. The ethnomusicologist A. M. Jones observes that what we call son clave, rumba clave, and the standard pattern are the most commonly used key patterns in sub-Saharan African music traditions, and he considers all three to be basically one and the same pattern. Clearly, they are all expressions of the same rhythmic principles. The 3 key patterns are found within a large geographic belt extending from Mali in northwest Africa to Mozambique in southeast Africa. 6/8 clave is used by North American musicians. In Afro-Cuban folkloric genres, the triple pulse rumba clave is the archetypal form of the guide pattern. Even when the drums are playing in duple pulse, as in Afro-Cuban, the clave is often played with displaced strokes that are closer to triple pulse than duple pulse. John Santos states, the proper feel of this, rumba clave rhythm, is actually closer to triple pulse. Conversely, in salsa and Latin jazz, especially as played in North America, 4/4 is the basic framework and 6/8 is considered something of a novelty and in some cases, an enigma. The cross-rhythmic structure is frequently misunderstood to be metrically ambiguous. North American musicians often refer to Afro-Cuban 6/8 rhythm as a feel, a term usually reserved for those aspects of musical nuance not practically suited for analysis. As used by North American musicians, 6/8 clave can refer to one of 3 types of triple pulse key patterns. Triple pulse standard pattern, When one hears triple pulse rhythms in Latin jazz, the percussion is most often replicating the Afro-Cuban rhythm bemba copyright. The standard bell is the key pattern used in bemba copyright, and so with compositions based on triple pulse rhythms, it is the 7-stroke bell, rather than the 5-stroke clave that is the most familiar to jazz musicians. Consequently, some North American musicians refer to the triple pulse standard pattern as 6/8 clave. Triple pulse rumba clave. Some refer to the triple pulse form of rumba clave as 6/8 clave. When rumba clave is written in June 8, the 4 underlying main beats are counted: 1, 2, 1, 2. 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a, XX. X. XX. Claves are not usually played in Afro-Cuban 6/8 feels. And the clave pattern is not traditionally played in June 8, though it may be helpful to do so to relate the clave to the 6/8 bell pattern Euro-3. The main exceptions are the form of rumba known as Colombia, and some performances of abakúa by rumba groups, where the 6/8 rumba clave pattern is played on claves. Triple pulse sun clave. Triple pulse sun clave is the least common form of clave used in Cuban music. It is, however, found across an enormously vast area of sub-Saharan Africa. The first published example of this pattern identified it as a hand clap part accompanying a song from Mozambique. Cross rhythm and the correct metric structure. Because 6/8 clave-based music is generated from cross rhythm, it is possible to count or feel the 6/8 clave in several different ways. The ethnomusicologist A. M. Jones correctly identified the importance of this key pattern, but he mistook its accents as indicators of meter rather than the counter-metric phenomena they actually are. Similarly, while Anthony King identified the triple pulse sun clave as the A-Euro standard pattern, a Euro unregistered trademark in its simplest and most basic form, he did not correctly identify its metric structure. King represented the pattern in a polymetric 7/8 plus 5/8 time signature. It wasn't until African musicologists like C.K. Ladzakpo entered into the discussion in the 1970s and 80s that the metric structure of sub-Saharan rhythm was unambiguously defined. The writings of Victor Kofi Agawu and David Locke must also be mentioned in this regard. In the diagram below, 6/8 clave is shown on top and a beat cycle is shown below it. Any or all of these structures may be the emphasis at a given point in a piece of music using the 6/8 clave. The example on the left represents the correct count and ground of the 6/8 clave. The 4 dotted quarter notes across the 2 bottom measures are the main beats. All clave patterns are built upon 4 main beats. The bottom measures on the other 2 examples show cross beats. Observing the dancer a Euro unregistered trademark S steps almost always reveals the main beats of the music. Because the main beats are usually emphasized in the steps and not the music, it is often difficult for an outsider to feel the proper metric structure without seeing the dance component. Kibik states, in order to understand the emotional structure of any music in Africa, one has to look at the dancers as well and see how they relate to the instrumental background. For cultural insiders, identifying the Euro dance fete, a Euro unregistered trademark, occurs instinctively and spontaneously. Those not familiar with the choreographic supplement, however, sometimes have trouble locating the main beats and expressing them in movement. Hearing African music on recordings alone without prior grounding in its dance-based rhythms may not convey the choreographic supplement. Not surprisingly, many misinterpretations of African rhythm and meter stem from a failure to observe the dance. 3-2/2-3 clave concept and terminology. In Cuban popular music, a chord progression can begin on either side of clave. When the progression begins on the 3 side, the song or song section is said to be in 3-2 clave. When the chord progression begins on the 2 side, it is in 2-3 clave. In North America, salsa and Latin jazz charts commonly represent clave in 2 measures of cut time. This is most likely the influence of jazz conventions. When clave is written in 2 measures, changing from one clave sequence to the other is a matter of reversing the order of the measures. Chord progression begins on the 3 side. Aguargio is a typical Cuban ostinato melody, most often consisting of arpeggiated chords and syncopated patterns. Guajios are a seamless blend of European harmonic and African rhythmic structures. Most guajios have a binary structure that expresses clave. Clave motif, Kevin Moore states, there are two common ways that the three-side is expressed in Cuban popular music. The first to come into regular use, which David P. ± Aloza calls clave motif, is based on the decorated version of the three-side of the clave rhythm. The following guajio example is based on a clave motif. The three-side consists of the tresillo variant known as cinquillo. Since this chord progression begins on the three-side, the song or song section is said to be in 3-2 clave. Offbeat-on-beat motif, more. By the 1940s, there was a trend toward the use of what P ± Aloza calls the offbeat-on-beat motif. Today, the offbeat-on-beat motif method is much more common. With this type of guajio motif, the three-side of clave is expressed with all offbeats. The following I4VIV progression is in a 3-2 clave sequence. It begins with an offbeat pickup on the pulse immediately before beat 1. With some guajios, offbeats at the end of the two-side, or onbeats at the end of the three-side service pickups leading into the next measure. Chord progression begins on the two-side, clave motif. A chord progression can begin on either side of clave. One can therefore be on either the three-side or the two-side because the harmonic progression, rather than the rhythmic progression, is the primary referent. The following guajio is based on the clave motif in a 2-3 sequence. The cinquillo rhythm is now in the second measure. On beat-off-beat motif, this guajio is in 2-3 clave because it begins on the downbeat, emphasizing the on-beat quality of the two-side. A figure has the same harmonic sequence as the earlier off-beat-on-beat example, but rhythmically, the attack point sequence of the two measures is reversed. Most salsa is in 2-3 clave, and most salsa piano guajios are based on the 2-3 on-beat-off-beat motif. Going from one side of clave to the other within the same song, the 3-2/2-3 concept and terminology was developed in New York City during the 1940s by Cuban-born Mario Bauza while he was the music director of Maquito and his Afro-Cubans. Bauza was a master at moving the song from one side of clave to the other. The following melodic excerpt is taken from the opening verses of Que Vengan los Rumberos by Maquito and his Afro-Cubans. Notice that the melody goes from one side of clave to the other and then back again. A measure of 2/4 moves the chord progression from the two-side, to the three-side. Later, another measure of 2/4 moves the start of the chord progression back to two-side. According to David P. ± Aloza, the first 4 1 or 2 claves of the verses are in 2-3. Following the measure of 2/4 the song flips to the three-side. It continues in 3-2 on the V7 chord for 4 1 or 2 claves. The second measure of 2/4 flips the song back to the two-side and the I chord. In songs like Que Vengan los Rumberos, the phrases continually alternate between a 3-2 framework and a 2-3 framework. It takes a certain amount of flexibility to repeatedly reorder your orientation in this way. The most challenging moments are the truncations and other transitional phrases where you pivot in order to move your point of reference from one side of clave to the other. Working in conjunction with the chord and clave changes, vocalist Frank Maquito Grillo creates an arc of tension release spanning more than a dozen measures. Initially Maquito sings the melody straight, but soon expresses the lyrics in the freer and more syncopated inspiration cubana of a folkloric rumba. By the time the song changes to 3-2 on the V7 chord, Maquito has developed a considerable amount of rhythmic tension by contradicting the underlying meter. That tension is then resolved when he sings on 3 consecutive main beats, followed by tresillo. In the measure immediately following tresillo the song returns to 2-3 and the I chord. Tito Puente learned the concept from Bauza. Tito Puente's Philadelphia Mambo is an example of a song that moves from one side of clave to the other. The technique eventually became a staple of composing and arranging in salsa and Latin jazz. According to Kevin Moore, clave direction is relative while clave alignment is absolute. If you walk from New York to Miami, you're walking south. If you walk from Miami to New York, you're walking north. But if you put your left shoe on your right foot, it's going to be a very awkward walk in either direction. Your shoes remain aligned with your feet regardless of the direction your feet are taking you, and regardless of how poorly they fit. Cuban folkloric musicians do not use the 3-2/2-3 system. Many Cuban performers of popular music do not use it either. The great Cuban conga player and band leader Mongo Santamara said, "Doña Euro unregistered trademark T, tell me about 3-2 or 2-3. In Cuba we just play. We feel it, we Doña Euro unregistered trademark T talk about such things." In another book, Santamara said, "In Cuba we Doña Euro unregistered trademark T think about, Clave. We know that we Euro unregistered trademark re and Clave. Because we know that we have to be in Clave to be a musician." According to Cuban pianist Sonny Bravo, the late Charlie Palmieri would insist that, theory a Euro unregistered trademark S no such thing as 3-2 or 2-3, theory a Euro unregistered trademark S only one Clave. The contemporary Cuban bassist, composer and arranger Alan Parr copyright res flatly states, "In Cuba we do not use the 2-3, 3-2 formula. 2-3, 3-2, is not used in Cuba. That is how people learn Cuban music outside Cuba." In non-Cuban music, controversy over use and origins, perhaps the greatest testament to the musical vitality of the clave is the spirited debate it engenders, both in terms of musical usage and historical origins. This section presents examples from non-Cuban music, which some musicians hold to be representative of clave. The most common claims, those of Brazilian and subsets of American popular music, are described below. In Africa, a widely used bell pattern, clave is a Spanish word, and its musical usage as a pattern played on claves was developed in the western part of Cuba, particularly the cities of Matanzas and Havana. Some writings have claimed that the clave patterns originated in Cuba. One frequently repeated theory is that the triple-pulse African bell patterns morphed into duple-pulse forms as a result of the influence of European musical sensibilities. The duple meter feel, a 4/4 rumba clave may have been the result of the influence of marching bands and other Spanish styles. A Euro was born. However, the duple-pulse forms have existed in sub-Saharan Africa for centuries. The patterns the Cubans call clave are two of the most common bell parts used in sub-Saharan African music traditions. Natalie Curtis, A. M. Jones, Anthony King and John Collins document the triple pulse forms of what we call a Euro-Uruguayan clave, a Euro and a Euro-Rumba clave, a Euro in West, Central and East Africa. Francis Kofi and C. K. Ladzakpo document several Ghanaian rhythms that use the triple or duple pulse forms of Sun clave. Royal Harrington identifies the duple pulse form of rumba clave as a bell pattern used by the Yoruba and Igbo of Nigeria, West Africa. There are many recordings of traditional African music where one can hear the 5-stroke clave used as a bell pattern. Popular dance music. Cuban music has been popular in sub-Saharan Africa since the mid-20th century. To the Africans, clave-based Cuban popular music sounded both familiar and exotic. Congolese bands started doing Cuban covers and singing the lyrics phonetically. Soon, they were creating their own original Cuban-like compositions, with lyrics sung in French or Lingala, a lingua franca of the Western Congo region. The Congolese called this new music rumba, although it was really based on the sun. The Africans adapted guajillos to electric guitars, and gave them their own regional flavor. The guitar-based music gradually spread out from the Congo, increasingly taking on local sensibilities. This process eventually resulted in the establishment of several different distinct regional genres, such as soukous. Soukous, the following soukous bass line is an embellishment of clave. Banning air distills down the Congolese guitar style to this skeletal figure, where clave is sounded by the bass notes. Highlife was the most popular genre in Ghana and Nigeria during the 1960s. This arpeggiated highlife guitar part is essentially a guajillo. The rhythmic pattern is known in Cuba as bacuateo. The pattern of attack points is nearly identical to the 3-2 clave motif guajillo shown earlier in this article. The bell pattern known in Cuba as clave, is indigenous to Ghana and Nigeria, and is used in high life. Afrobeat. The following Afrobeat guitar part is a variant of the 2-3 on-beat offbeat motif. Even the melodic contour is guajillo-based. 2-3 clave is shown above the guitar for reference only. The clave pattern is not ordinarily played in Afrobeat. Guide patterns in Cuban versus non-Cuban music. There is some debate as to whether or not clave, as it appears in Cuban music, functions in the same way as its sister rhythms in other forms of music. Certain forms of Cuban music demand a strict relationship between the clave and other musical parts, even across genres. This same structural relationship between the guide pattern and the rest of the ensemble is easily observed in many sub-Saharan rhythms, as well as rhythms from Haiti and Brazil. However, the 3-2/2-3 concept and terminology is limited to certain types of Cuban-based popular musics and is not used in the music of Africa, Haiti, Brazil or in Afro-Cuban folkloric music. In American pop music, the clave pattern tends to be used as an element of rhythmic color, rather than a guide pattern, and as such is superimposed over many types of rhythms. In Brazilian music, both Cuba and Brazil imported Yoruba, Fon and Congolese slaves. Therefore, it is not surprising that we find the bell pattern the Cubans call clave in the Afro-Brazilian musics of Candombe, copyright, Macumba and Maculila. Son clave and rumba clave are also used as a tambourine part in some batucada arrangements. The structure of Afro-Brazilian bell patterns can be understood in terms of the clave concept. Although a few contemporary Brazilian musicians have adopted the 3-2/2-3 terminology, it is traditionally not a part of the Brazilian rhythmic concept. Bell pattern 1 is used in Maculila and some Candombe copyright and Macumba rhythms. Pattern 1 is known in Cuba as son clave. Bell 2 is used in a folksa and can be thought of as pattern 1 embellished with 4 additional strokes. Bell 3 is used in batucada. Pattern 4 is the maracatu bell and can be thought of as pattern 1 embellished with 4 additional strokes. An example in a pixinguana coro musica, bossa nova pattern. The so-called bossa nova clave has a similar rhythm to that of the son clave, but the second note on the two side is delayed by 1 pulse. The rhythm is typically played as a snare rim pattern in bossa nova music. The pattern is shown below in February 4, as it is written in Brazil. In North American charts it is more likely to be written in cut time. According to drummer Bobby Sanabria, the Brazilian composer Antonio Carlos Jobim, who developed the pattern, considers it to be merely a rhythmic motif and not a clave. Jobim later regretted that Latino musicians misunderstood the role of this bossa nova pattern. Other Brazilian examples. The examples below are transcriptions of several patterns resembling the Cuban clave that are found in various styles of Brazilian music, on the agogá and surdo instruments. Legend, time signature, 2/4. L equals low bell, H equals high bell, O equals open surdo hit, X equals muffled surdo hit, and divides the measure, style samba 3/2. LLLHHLLLH. Style, maracatu 3/2. LHHLHLHLHH, style, samba 3/2. LLLL. LLL, instrument, third surdo 2/3. XOOOXOO. Variation of samba style, partido alto 2/3. LHLLHLL. Style, maracatu 2/3. LHLHLHHLH. Style, samba reggae or bossa nova 3/2. OOO. OO, style, ijexa 3/2. LLLLLLLL. For third example above, the clave pattern is based on a common accompaniment pattern played by the guitarist. B equals bass note played by guitarist's thumb, C equals chord played by fingers. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and CBCCBC. BCBCC. The singer enters on the wrong side of the clave and the agogá player adjusts accordingly. This recording cuts off the first bar so that it sounds like the bell comes in on the third beat of the second bar. This is suggestive of a predetermined rhythmic relationship between the vocal part and the percussion, and supports the idea of a clave-like structure in Brazilian music. In Jamaican and French Caribbean music, the son-clave rhythm is present in Jamaican mento music, and can be heard on 1950s-era recordings such as Donia Euro unregistered trademark T Fence Herin, Green Guava, or Limbo by Lord Ticola, Mango Time by Count Lasher, Linstead Market Day-O by the Wigglers, Bargy by the Tower Islanders, Ni Buchanza by Laurel Aitken and others. The Jamaican population is partly of the same origin as many Cubans, which perhaps explains the shared rhythm. It is also heard frequently in Martinique's Biguin and Dominica's Jingping. Just as likely however is the possibility that claves and the clave rhythm spread to Jamaica, Trinidad and the other small islands of the Caribbean through the popularity of Cuban son recordings from the 1920s onward. In African American music, Tresillo Foundation. There is an absence of drums and complex polyrhythms in early blues. There is, in addition, the very specific absence of timeline patterns in virtually all early 20th century U.S. African American music, except in cases where these patterns were borrowed from Puerto Rico or Cuba. Only in New Orleans genres does a hint of simple timeline patterns occur. These do not function in the same way as African timeline patterns are Euro-Cubic. While key patterns were absent from early 20th century African American music, Tresillo, the first half of clave, has been present since at least the mid-19th century. Wynton Marsalis considers Tresillo to be the clave of New Orleans. The use of Tresillo and its variant, the habanera rhythm, in African American music was reinforced by consecutive waves of Cuban popular music, beginning with the habanera. For the more than quarter century in which the cakewalk, ragtime, and proto-jazz were forming and developing, the habanera was a consistent part of African American popular music. Afro-Cuban music became the conduit through which African American music was re-Africanized, through the adoption of figures like clave and instruments like the conga drum, bongos, maracas and claves. Jazz. Although clave-like phrases are found in early 20th century African American music, the use of the clave pattern as an overt rhythmic motif does not appear until the 1940s with the birth of Afro-Cuban jazz. The first original jazz composition to be overtly based in clave was Tango by Mario Bauza. Bauza introduced bebop innovator Dizzy Gillespie to the Cuban conga drummer Chano Pizzo. The short musical collaboration of Gillespie and Pizzo introduced Cuban rhythms into mainstream jazz. However, their groundbreaking experiments did not always mesh rhythmically. For example, in their 1948 performance of Manteca the clave pattern is played in 3-2, while the rest of the band is in 2-3. Despite its initial problems in performance, Manteca proved to be a strong composition and it stands today as the first jazz standard to be based in clave. R&B. The use of clave in R&B coincided with the growing dominance of the backbeat, and the rising popularity of Cuban music in the U.S. In a sense, clave can be distilled down to Tresillo answered by the backbeat. New Orleans musicians such as Dave Bartholomew and Professor Longhair incorporated Cuban instruments as well as the clave pattern and related two-cell figures in songs such as Carnival Day, and Mardi Gras in New Orleans. While some of these early experiments were awkward fusions, it wasn't long before the Afro-Cuban elements were integrated into the New Orleans sound. Robert Palmer reports that, in the 1940s, Professor Longhair listened to and played with musicians from the islands and fell under the spell of Perez Prado's mambo records. The Hawkettes, in Mardi Gras Mambo, make a clear reference to Prado in their use of his trademark UNHH. In the break after the introduction, the Bo Diddley beat is perhaps the first true fusion of 3-2 clave and R&B rock and roll. Watch, Hey Bo Diddley performed live by Bo Diddley. There is no documentation of a direct Cuban connection to Bo Diddley's adaptation of the clave rhythm. Bo Diddley has given different accounts of the riff's origins. However, Ned Sublette asserts, in the context of the time, and especially those maracas, heard on the record, Bo Diddley has to be understood as a Latin-tinged record. A rejected cut recorded at the same session was titled only Rumba on the track sheets. Johnny Otis Willie and the Hand Jive is another example of this successful blend of 3-2 clave and R&B. Watch, Hand Jive performed by Johnny Otis. The Johnny Otis Show. Otis used the Cuban instruments claves and maracas on the song. The song Little Darling is also built around clave. The bass riffs of China Grove by the Doobie Brothers use clave. The bass line in the 1973 arrangement of Herbie Hancock's Watermelon Man is based on Sun Clave. The Macarena uses clave. Another example includes the song Not Fade Away, originally written by Buddy Holly, but performed by a number of artists including the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, and Rush. In fact, there are hundreds of other examples throughout jazz and popular music. Funk. The 2-3 clave on-beat offbeat motif is the basis for a great deal of funk music. Blues scales give these rhythmic figures their own distinct quality. The main guitar riff for James Brown's Bring It Up is an example of an on-beat offbeat motif. Rhythmically, the pattern is similar to the typical Cuban guajillo structure, but tonally, it is unmistakably funky. Bongos are used on the 1967 version. The rhythm is slightly swung. Ain't It Funky has a 2-3 guitar riff. Give It Up or Turn It Loose has a similarly funky 2-3 structure. The tonal structure has a bare-bones simplicity, emphasizing the pattern of attack points. Experimental clave music, art music, the clave rhythm and clave concept have been used in some modern art music compositions. Rumba clave by Cuban percussion virtuoso Roberto Vizaya ±O has been performed in recital halls around the world. C. Rumba clave. Another clave-based composition that has gone global is the snare drum suite Cross by Eugene D. Novotny. C. Cross. Jazz, ensemble clave-based rhythms translate well to a jazz drum kit. C. Comping in clave by Connie Guilfoyle. The clave matrix offers infinite possibilities for rhythmic textures in jazz. The Cuban-born drummer Daphnis Prieto in particular, has been a trailblazer in expanding the parameters of clave experimentation. C. Drum solo with displaced clave. Odd meter clave. Technically speaking, the term odd meter clave is an oxymoron. Clave consists of two even halves, in a divisive structure of four main beats. However, in recent years jazz musicians from Cuba and outside of Cuba have been experimenting with creating new claves, and related patterns in various odd meters. Clave, which is traditionally used in a divisive rhythm structure, has inspired many new creative inventions in an additive rhythm context. C. Songo with clave in 9. I developed the concept of adjusting claves to other time signatures, with varying degrees of success. What became obvious to me quite quickly was that the closer I stuck to the general rules of clave, the more natural the pattern sounded. Clave has a natural flow with certain tension and resolve points. I found if I kept these points in the new meters they could still flow seamlessly, allowing me to play longer phrases. It also gave me many reference points and reduced my reliance on one Guilfoyle. Recommended listening for odd meter clave. Here are some examples of recordings that use odd meter clave concepts. Daphnis Prieto about the monks. Sebastian Skong Symbiosis. Paley Measures Me Timba. John Benitez de Scarga in New York. Deep Rumba, A Calm in the Fire of Dances. Nashito Herrera Bem en Mi Casa. Bobby Sanabria Quarteto Aka Copyright. Julio Barreto Iebo. Michelle Camilo Triangulo. Samuel Torres Skin Tones. Horatio El Negro Hernandez Italuba. Tony Lujan Tribute. Edward Simon La Bikina. Jorge Sylvester and the Ear of the Beholder. Yuli Gesenda for the extension, see also, Salsa, Cha-Hatra Danza Cuban, Rumba, Bell Pattern, Sub-Saharan African Music Traditions, Notes. References, Morlia Cuban, Rebecca. Salsa Guidebook for Piano and Ensemble. Petaluma, California, Show Music. ISBN 0-9614701-9-4. Moore, Kevin. Understanding Clave and Clave Changes, Singing, Clapping and Dancing Exercises. Santa Cruz, More Music. ISBN 146642302, Ortiz, Fernando. La Africania de la Música Folclórica de Cuba. Editions Universals, en Espar plus or minus all. Hardcover illustrated edition. ISBN 84-89750-18-1. Palmer, Robert. A Tale of Two Cities, Memphis Rock and New Orleans Roll Brooklyn. P plus or minus Aloza, David. The Clave Matrix. Afro-Cuban Rhythm, Its Principles and African Origins. Rodway, California, BAM Incorporated. ISBN 1-886502-80-3, P plus or minus Aloza, David. Rumba Quinto. Rodway, California, BEM Books. ISBN 1-4537-1313-1. Stewart, Alexander. Funky Drummer, New Orleans, James Brown and the Rhythmic Transformation of American Popular Music. Popular Music, v. 19, n. October 3, 2000, PA 293-318. External links, The Four Great Clave Debates, Clave Concepts. Afro-Cuban Rhythms, An Introduction to Clave Theory, Clave Patterns, Clave Changes in the Music of Charanga Habanera, Clave Analysis of Charanga Habanera's Tremendo Delirio, Bossa Nova Clave, Video about Bossa Nova Clave, Family of Cuban Clave Patterns, BBC World Service, Special Reports, A Short History of Five Notes.